walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom, walking and talking with my mind.
Reverend Blackmon is not only the senior pastor of a congregation in Missouri, but she's also a registered nurse of 25 years plus. She's an author, an executive minister of justice, and a local minister for the United Church of Christ, as well as an advocate for community engagement and change. Reverend Blackmon was also recognized as a frontline member of the organizers in the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri. In this interview, we will be discussing the relationship between Christian scripture and traditions, as well as voter participation and fair districting. So I'm going to start off with a question, if you can hear me, Reverend Blackmon.
I can hear you, Kiki.
According to Christian doctrine, do we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens, to our community members, in order to uphold a conception of justice, a conception of what is right or what is wrong? What do we owe to other people according to Christian doctrine?
Thank you for that question. I think that the relationship between humanity and one another, as well as the relationship between humanity and God, of course, are chronicled from the beginning of Scripture when God says to us as humankind that we have dominion over creation, over the environment, over the land, but dominion not as in authority to lord over, but as stewardship of. So I think that that is embedded from the beginning of Christian scripture and continues throughout Christian scripture in every iteration that we see play out in text. So even if we go to from the Genesis account of that to Noah and the flood, right? The same commands that were given to Adam, the beginning of humanity, are given to Noah once the ark is reopened, and Noah is once again charged with care and tending for creation and for humanity. And that plays all the way through the First Testament into the Second Testament.
Thank you for that response. Speaking on this question of care and of being faithful to doctrine, can you talk a little bit about the importance of electoral participation as a Christian? What does it mean to vote, and what does it have to do with caring for one's fellow neighbor, according to you?
Well, absolutely. The prophet Micah says in the First Testament that what the Lord requires of us is that we do justice and that we love mercy and that we walk humbly with our God. And that's a scripture that I have really taken to heart. One of the ways that we do justice in our current context is by engaging in the electoral process. We are governed, we are a country that are governed by laws, and we are, in some ways, those laws are enforced and sometimes even interpreted by the people that we put in office. Those people that we put in office elect who our Supreme Court justices are. They decide what municipalities receive what services and how they receive those services and how money is allocated. And all of these are issues of justice, issues of equity. Sometimes when we talk about justice, it can be confusing because justice is also what we talk about when we're saying right versus wrong, and that's certainly a part of it. But justice, in terms of what it means to honor the divinity and the humanity of every human being as being valuable and worthy of care. It means, at least in part, to treat the people's needs as holy. And one of the ways that we acknowledge the divinity of people, the humanity of people as holy, is by participating in the electoral process that will result in giving us representation at the highest levels of government to address the needs of the people.
Hmm. And thinking about these inherent biases, I feel like that's very much intertwined with the conversation on redlining. Thinking about how
Mm-hmm.
different districts are divided unfairly due to questions or identities of race or class, other kinds of
Mm-hmm.
backgrounds or social identities. Have you seen the
Mm-hmm.
effects of redlining in your own home community or in your own like faith based space?
as an adult moving to St. Louis when I was 23, I'm now 57. I've been here all of that time, and there's still redlining in St. Louis. There's still neighborhoods and areas where the unspoken rule is that you don't sell your home to a person that is black or a person that is brown. And we don't have that just in white neighborhoods, but we have it in Italian neighborhoods. People segregate for all kinds of reasons. I also see in St. Louis, we have a street that's called the Del Mar Divide. And it was another incident of redlining. People who were black and brown hue lived on one side of Del Mar, and people who were white or affluent. So there were some black people on the south side of Del Mar. But across that one street in the city of St. Louis, there's a 26-year lifespan difference between the life of a white man on the south side of Del Mar and the life of a black man on the north side of Del Mar. Because those who were um, economically challenged, those who were forced to live in places that did not have all the resources, not all the health care, not all of the uh, um, food options, more fast food, more unhealthy food. All of those things played into the impact on the lifespan across that line, and that line remains today. Um, the other impact of redlining that comes straight to mind is that in St. Louis, as in many cities, the educational system is based on property taxes. And so, if you redlined people who are economically challenged, and whether that economic challenge comes because of race or lack of access to those things that would put you in a better state of being, and then you make the educational system based on the property taxes that they pay versus the property taxes that wealthy people pay or more established people pay or people who have higher paying jobs, then you perpetuate generationally uh, an, um, an inequity in education that then continues to perpetuate the economic disparity between people of different hues.
Thinking about healthcare, thinking about educational disparities and economic disparities as well, and how all of these things influence the likelihood that someone is going to go vote on election day. Could you talk a little bit
Hmm.
about the difficulties of getting to the polls if you are wading through the challenges of living in a particularly economically challenged community, and some of the things that you've done to combat these difficulties and influencing folks to vote, even if they're going through the manifestations of oppression in their own lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly at this time in our history, there are a couple of challenges that we must address in that way. Um, First of all, um, for some, for some, there is a lack of motivation to vote because there is a lack of hope. If you've lived your entire life in an area, in a community that is oppressed and depressed, and you don't see a way out of that community, then you are less likely to see, and this is not universal, we're not monolithic people, but you are less likely to see the benefits and the impact of voting. I saw that happen to a lot of people who motivated around the election of Barack Obama, and thought that the election of Barack Obama would mean that life would change for them, and it did not. It changed for some people, but it did not change for all people. And for those who did not experience that change, for some of them, that was their verification that voting was a waste of time. That's one way, one challenge that we have. We also have the challenge of racism being juxtaposed upon our legal system, so that we have a disproportionate percentage of black and brown bodies who are caged in our prison industrial complex. And many of them lose their right to vote, and many of them don't exercise their right to vote when they are released from prison. Um, they just don't go back into that system. Currently, we also deal with those who may have some reason They may be legal residents in the United States, but have had fear tactics used on them, and they don't want to go to the polls for fear of having any kind of investigation that might cause them to lose their status in the U.S. And then there are people who just don't have access to the polls because we've closed down so many polling stations that are in neighborhoods of black and brown people. We saw that happen in Wisconsin just a few months ago, and we saw it happen in Georgia in the governor's election with Kemp and Stacey Abrams. And so we also have those issues that we have to deal with, which are race based. Sometimes it's just too much of a burden. In my church, as a local pastor, we implemented a program called Souls to the Polls. We got it from Florida. Though Florida had Sunday voting, we don't have Sunday voting, but we used that name and called it Souls to the Polls from St. Louis. We did extra efforts to educate people on voting because it's not just about registering people to vote, it's educating them to understand how to vote for the candidates that have their best interest in heart without telling them who to vote for, right? My favorite statement is to vote for yourself. Research the candidates enough to know what their voting record is. Because it's always fascinating in election time, you'll have all kinds of politicians in these same neighborhoods we're talking about, and we won't see them again until it's voting time again. So we must do the diligent work of looking up records and see how they're voting and explain to people what the impact will be if we don't vote. It's not going to be that hard to explain the impact in this current cycle because under this current administration, we have suffered more setbacks collectively as black and brown people, and I would suggest as people in general, we've experienced more setbacks than we ever have. And so our only way to remedy that is to get people out to the polls to vote and ask them to vote for themselves. I'm not going to tell you to vote for Republican or a Democrat because, quite frankly, neither is perfect. But if you put your interest and the interest of your family and the interest of your people in the forefront of your mind, then the options become more clear.